Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This is Reliable Sources, our weekly look at the story behind the story of how the media really works and how the news gets made. Coming up here, exclusive reporting about President Trump and media mogul Rupert Murdoch. Plus, a look at how big money lawsuits are endangering newsrooms. But first, breaking news. The White House now responding to overwhelming criticism of the president's Saturday statement about the violence in Charlottesville. His speech will be remembered, and not fondly, as the many-side speech for not explicitly calling out and condemning the white nationalists, the racists and anti-Semites who came to Charlottesville and protested on Friday and Saturday. Now, on Sunday morning, the White House attempting cleanup. This is a statement just out from an unnamed White House official. Quote, "The president said very strongly in his statement yesterday that he condemns all forms of violence, bigotry, and hatred, and of course that includes white supremacists, KKK, there's a typo here, notice it, nephew Nazi, and all extremist groups. He called for national unity and bringing all Americans together." I assume when they said nephew Nazi, they meant neo-Nazi. I assume that's a typo, but I just wanted to show you exactly what the White House put out. There are obvious questions when you read a statement like this. Why did it take so long? And why is the statement unsigned? Is the president himself directly going to address the criticism? You could make the case that Saturday was the worst day of the Trump presidency, with so many commentators, including many Republican commentators and GOP senators and congressmen, criticizing the president for his half-hearted response. Today, Sunday, the reactions are still withering. Here's the headline on the influential Drudge Report: "Make America Hate Again," reacting to the chaos in Virginia. And take a look at the front pages from the local newspaper, the Daily Progress, doing great work there in Charlottesville. This is the Saturday headline about Friday's torch-bearing rally. These white nationalists, some of them explicitly racist, rallying on the campus of UVA. "Fire and Fury" is the headline. And now let's look at Sundays. This is the new headline this morning: "A Day of Death," reacting to the woman who was killed when that man charged a crowd of counter-protesters with his car, and then two police officials killed when their helicopter crashed in Charlottesville. Amid all of this coverage, what is the responsibility of the press, especially in showing violent and disturbing images, the kind that played on a loop yesterday, showing a nation seemingly at war with itself? Is this constant repetition helpful? Is sunlight the best disinfectant when it comes to racists? Or is there a better way? A lot to cover now with our panel. NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik is here, along with CNN White House reporter Caitlin Collins. But I want to go first to Charlottesville and Larry Sabato. He's the director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia. And Larry, I know this is personal for you. You were on campus Friday night. Those scenes of those mostly men, mostly young men, carrying torches, trying to express their views, their largely racist, anti-Semitic views. What was your experience on Friday night at UVA?
Well, Brian, I live on Jefferson's lawn in a pavilion that he designed, and it's right next to the rotunda. And I watched this group of young people, mainly young people, as you said, in their upper teens, 20s, 30s, march with their torches lit. And I was shocked first at how many of them there were. There were hundreds. I'd hate to put an exact number on it, but it went on and on. It was longer than our graduation lines. And then they got closer, and I heard what they were chanting. And they were chanting, "You will not replace us." And that was alternated with, "Jews will not replace us." Then they got to the front of the rotunda, and it didn't take them but a few minutes to do what they'd really come to do, get a lot of media attention by attacking the relative handful of counter-protesters who were there. This was all unplanned, by the way. We didn't know they were going to do it until late in the day Friday when some rumors started coming around.
So Saturday was planned, Saturday's rally, but not Friday night.
not Friday night. It came as a surprise to everybody, and I just can't, as somebody who has been associated with the University of Virginia for 47 years, Brian, this was the most disturbing, nauseating thing I have ever witnessed there, and right there on the lawn, which is the center of our university. I don't know how long it's going to take us to get over this.
Everybody who's been to Charlottesville, loves walking the downtown mall, but that's where this act of domestic terrorism happened yesterday. This car plowing into a group of counter-protesters, people protesting the white nationalists. So now it's Sunday morning. What is your feeling a day later?
My feeling is one of course, shock and upset for the lives that were lost, including those 2 state policemen in the helicopter. They had been watching what was going on downtown and sending intelligence. But it's also a fear of dread. It's dread, rather. It's, Brian, they're talking about coming back again and again. You knew this was going to be a big thing when that snake, David Duke, slithered out from under his rock and showed up, the former Grand Wizard of the KKK.
Well, that's interesting, Larry. I just got an email from a viewer who said, what's the responsibility of the press, Brian? The responsibility is, quote, not to broadcast any statement by David Duke. Do you agree?
I think they should be minimized. I think if he says something truly newsworthy, you have to. But I think it should be minimized. And actually, I think the coverage of any future gatherings in Charlottesville should be minimized. It has to happen. You have to have some cameras and reporters there. You got to have the police to protect them. But assuming we can keep the violence at a minimum or maybe no violence at all, I think it should be, you know, a minute or 2 package on the evening news. That would be the ideal, as unrepresentative and unrealistic as that may be.
Let's broaden this out with David Folkenflik and Caitlin Collins here in New York. David, same question to you on this issue of how to handle violent images, pictures of these protests that turn into these melees. Are cable news channels, television news networks actually making things worse by playing this on a loop?
I think if you play the image of the car, as you say, essentially upending these anti-racist counter-protesters again and again and again, it gives a sense, underscores the notion of violence in society, and in some ways subliminally, I think, conveys the idea that this is happening repeatedly. Cable executives say we have to cover the news. I think we can make finer distinctions than that. My first professional gig, 27 years ago, was as an intern for the Charleston News and Courier, as it was then called, in South Carolina. And I was assigned to cover a couple of Klan rallies, one of which was through downtown Charleston, one of which was outside of town. The editor-in-chief comes to my desk. He says, David, you're going to cover it. You're going to cover it fairly. If something truly newsworthy happens, we'll cover it big. We are not going to give these racists, these Klansmen, these other protesters who are there, more coverage than they warrant simply because they want to say outrageous things.
The counter-argument being that the press is doing a service here by exposing what's going on in these people's minds.
I think there's an obligation to cover this, but I think that you can, this is not a binary choice, folks. Like, we may have to make subtle distinctions and smart choices and ways in which we convey things. Should David Duke be quoted? I think some of what he said yesterday was newsworthy. Should David Duke be quoted at length? Should David Duke be represented as though he has a grand movement behind him? I think these are things that we have to also be very clear about.
Cover this, but make clear these are fringe folks. There are not a lot of folks that agree to this stuff, but they are out there by the hundreds yesterday.
And you know, folks, 1,500 is not a huge rally given the rallies that we've seen in the past year, and yet it is a real presence. It upended a real community. There was genuine violence. I think we have a responsibility to reflect that in the press, and a responsibility not to somehow foster the idea that this is the way in which the country as a whole is moving.
And we learned something about the president as a result of yesterday's coverage. Caitlin, I would argue we learned about something from the president based on how long he took to respond initially on Twitter, and then at that event he was having at 3 p.m. And we've learned something today from this cleanup statement from the White House official. What was your reaction as a White House reporter about this delayed reaction from the president to these white supremacists meeting in Charlottesville?
Well, we're essentially seeing the White House drag this entire thing out. Obviously, you made the point the president has faced widespread criticism over his statement yesterday that did not specify white nationalist or white supremacist and did not condemn them. He just said hate from many sides. And then we get this statement from the White House this morning in response to that, and it's attributed to an unnamed White House official. Why would you not attribute that to a White House official like Sarah Huckabee Sanders or another spokesman or the president himself, if he really does condemn hatred in all forms, including neo-Nazis and the KKK, why would you not just put your name on that statement? And we know that the president is someone who is very quick to respond to other incidents. He was very quick to respond to the Pulse nightclub shooting and the Paris attacks and even what happened in Manila, which wasn't terrorism. And yesterday, as this dragged out and these graphic images were playing out on cable television, which we know the president loves, he didn't say anything about it until 1:20 in the afternoon.
He's caused us to expect instant reactions because of his tendency to reply to cable news coverage.
Exactly.
So
the
when he
First
doesn't,
Lady
it's even more
responded
noticeable.
before he did.
Let's listen to Anthony Scaramucci this morning criticizing the president.
Well, I wouldn't have recommended that statement. I think he needed to be much harsher as it related to the white supremacists and the nature of that.
Scaramucci, of course, only lasted 10 days as comms director, had 4 press avails, answering like 50 questions total, and he promised to hold a press conference on Monday. So could that be the next opportunity for him to address Charlottesville?
It could be. He has no events on his schedule today, which means reporters will not see the president while he's on his working vacation in New Jersey. But you're right. The president took more questions this week than he had taken in months. He was taking questions from reporters. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the press secretary, was holding up a sign that said one more question, initially like directing the president to stop taking questions, and he ignored it and kept going and kept taking questions. But then yesterday when this happened, he tweeted that he was going to hold a big press conference yesterday.
Right.
And then during that, he just delivered a statement and took no questions from reporters and left the room. So now he's saying when he returns to Washington on Monday for a brief trip that he's going to hold this major press conference, and that might be the only time we see him unless he tweets again today about this.
Right.
You know, what struck me in some ways is that there was a bit of a sense of what we had after Katrina. Different kind of disaster, different kind of scope of tragedy. And at the same time, you saw the press tonally turn on the White House in a way that was direct and focused. And you saw it through the tweets and the statements and the commentary of conservative members of the press. You saw the New York Post had a cover today that called it terrorism, talked about white supremacism, was very explicit in a way. This is Rupert Murdoch's tabloid, right? Very explicit in the way that Trump himself would not be. You saw people basically, reporters who are, you know, straightforward reporters as well as folks on the left and the right, almost beseeching the president and the administration to get in front of this, or at least get in the moment, and it didn't happen.
It's a great point.
And it was a fascinating thing to watch play out, and it was troubling. You know, reporters don't, despite what you hear about it, most of the time reporters don't want to be in that situation.
But there's
they don't
an
want to have to do
expectation
that.
about how the president's going to speak, how any president's going to
Well,
speak.
Trump set this expectation for himself by criticizing Obama regularly for not calling things what they were. He criticized him for not saying radical Islamic terrorism so many times on the campaign trail. And then yesterday we saw the president have an opportunity to call this out for what it was, and he declined.
Final word to Larry Sabato, since you're in Charlottesville, Larry. Does what the president says in the coming days matter in Charlottesville? Will it actually help or affect the community?
Thanks for asking that, Brian, because Donald Trump, of course, is very unpopular anyway here, but he missed his moment. He had the opportunity to do something when it mattered yesterday afternoon, and any of his predecessors in modern times would have had the good instincts to say the right things. He wouldn't, because he won't denounce part of his base. They are white supremacists. We know what they are. We know who they voted for. So listen, Brian, if he wants to do something and to help us and everybody else, let him fire all the white nationalists on his staff, starting with Steve Bannon. Actions speak louder than words. Words written by a staff.
You know Bannon would reject being described as a white nationalist. You know that.
I don't care. We've read all that we need to read, and there are others on that staff too. You know darn well they are.
Larry, David, Caitlin, thank you very much. David, please stick around. We do have a bit more news just coming into us about this. Virginia's governor now identifying the woman killed in the vehicular attack yesterday. 32-year-old Heather Heyer. She was killed when that car went ramming, when that driver rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters. They were there to speak out against the white supremacists who had come to Charlottesville.